Welcome, everybody. My name is Mina Jane. I'm the director of the Ashland Public Library in Massachusetts. As Jeremy was just saying, there's people here from all over the country, but it's nice to see Massachusetts well represented. We're going to be talking about Boston Light tonight with Jeremy, one of my very favorite speakers. We've had several programs with him, and if you've been here before, you know they're going to be amazing. Before we get started, I just want to say a couple things. I would like to thank the Friends of the Ashland Public Library for supporting all of our programs. We couldn't do this fun stuff without them. And I'd also like to thank Jeremy for always letting us share this program with other libraries, because when libraries work together, we create like magical programs like this. So thanks, Jeremy. I do want to say I will be turning the chat off during Jeremy's slides, and I will turn them back on when he's finished so that there's no distractions. You can just pay attention. And if you have questions for Jeremy, please put them in the Q&A, which is a button at the bottom of your Zoom screen, and I will moderate them when he is done with his slides. So as I said, Jeremy Downtremont, he's been here several times with us before, usually for Haunted Lighthouses, which is actually my favorite talk that he gives, but I'm really looking forward to this one about Boston Light, 3 Centuries of History, which talks about Boston, the Boston Light Station, the site of the very first lighthouse on the North American continent. And Jeremy knows well what he speaks. He is the president and historian of the American Lighthouse Foundation, historian for the U.S. Lighthouse Society, and an author of more than 20 books and hundreds of articles on lighthouses and maritime history. And he never, ever disappoints, always has really interesting stories to tell. So I'm really looking forward to this. Jeremy, welcome. So glad you're here with us tonight.
Thank you so much, Mina. It's always a pleasure. Thank you for that nice introduction. Just one small correction. As of the end of last year, I'm no longer president of the American Lighthouse Foundation after 10 years. So I still love the American Lighthouse Foundation, but I am the historian for the U.S. Lighthouse Society, and I'll probably say a little bit more about that at the end of the presentation. But and I'm a Massachusetts guy. It's nice to see so many people from around Massachusetts here today, as well as people in other parts of the country. I grew up in Lynn, Mass, so yeah, I've been around Boston Harbor a lot of my life. I lived in Winthrop for 15 years. Been in Portsmouth, New Hampshire for, can't believe it, but 24 years now, but still only an hour from the Boston area. So Boston Harbor is near and dear to my heart. And Boston Light, as I'll tell you as I go along here, was kind of helped ignite my interest in lighthouses. I got into lighthouses in the mid 80s, but then I got very involved with Boston Light in the late 80s, and that really accelerated things. As I said, I lived in Winthrop, and I joined Friends of the Boston Harbor Islands, and they were running tours to Boston Light in the late 80s. Excuse me, a couple of times a year, at least a couple of times, probably 3 or 4 times a year. And I started helping out with those. So I would be either at the top of the lighthouse or the bottom of the lighthouse during those tours, and fell in love with the beauty of the place. As you can see in this is a helicopter shot I took in 2001, and to me, Boston Light, it's kind of what a lighthouse should be. I think it's it looks like what people think of when they think of a lighthouse, a tall white tower on an island. It's perfect. But I fell in love with the beauty of the place, and then I learned how interesting the history is, and that's what I'm going to talk about today. Let me show you a map here.
Oh, Jeremy, all of a sudden you're muted again. You're muted.
I know exactly what happened. I was trying to advance the slide, and I guess the cursor was over the microphone icon.
No.
Thank you for saying that right away. So you probably didn't hear me when I started talking about this slide, which obviously is a map. It's an old map. Excuse me, an old map of the harbor showing the locations of the lighthouses over the years. You see all those red dots. There have been 11 lighthouses in Boston Harbor over the centuries. There are only 3 today. Boston Light, Graves Light up towards the upper right of the map here, and Long Island Headlight inside the tower. But we did have a bunch of other ones. There were actually 4 lighthouses on Spectacle Island. If you look, you can see my cursor, Mina, right? When I do this, you can see my cursor or not?
Yes, I can.
You can see it. Okay, good. So I'm pointing out Spectacle Island in the Inner Harbor here, where there were at one time four lighthouses. There are actually two pairs of what they call range lights, but those are all gone, and several of the others are gone. So we just have three out of those 11 lighthouses in the harbor today. And here's a map showing the location of Boston Light. It is the southernmost of a group of islands in the outer harbor called the Brewster Islands. It's on Little Brewster Island. And excuse me, I'm going to clear my throat for a second. Just give me a moment here. I just muted myself so I don't clear my throat loudly in everybody's ears. So it is on Little Brewster Island. You can see how that is closer to the town of Hull on the south shore. Than it is to Boston. It's about 5 miles from the Inner Harbor in Boston. And the Brewster Islands are, as I said, a cluster of islands named after the elder Brewster of the Massachusetts Bay Colony. And Little Brewster is the smallest, and it's attached to another larger island, Great Brewster, at low tide. But all the shipping traffic for many, many years passed between Boston Light and Hull, or the majority of the larger ships would go in that way into the harbor. Later, they improved the upper channel north of that and put Graves Light at the entrance to what's called the Broad Sound Channel, and that kind of took the place of the earlier channel for the most part. So I'm just going to give you a little quick rundown of lighthouse history. I just want to make the point that when Boston Light was established in 1716, there were only a very small number of lighthouses in the world. I'm not sure exactly how many, but really just a handful. As you see in my list here, going back to well BC, at least 1300 BC, the Trojans built, I don't think you'd call it a lighthouse, but a tower with a fire on it. And that's true of several of the ancient civilizations, the Greeks, the Romans, the Macedonians, and Phoenicians, and various early civilizations built lighthouses, or at least, again, towers with fires on them to serve for navigation. Then the one that a lot of people consider the first really major lighthouse in the world was the Pharaohs of Alexandria, which was built around 280 BC at the mouth of the Nile, and it was somewhere in the vicinity of 450 feet tall, had a giant fire and mirror at the top that was supposedly visible. They say things like 100 miles, but that's impossible with the curvature of the earth. But anyway, quite an amazing structure, one of the seven wonders of the ancient world. And there's a drawing of it on the right there. The oldest lighthouse in England was built by the Romans at Dover. That is the ruins of the lighthouse at Dover in the lower right there. I took that picture when I was over there in 2022. That was built around 53 AD. So I don't know if you can call that a lighthouse today. It's the remains of a lighthouse, but that is basically the oldest standing, almost complete lighthouse in the world. Around 200 AD, you had the La Coruña Lighthouse, also known as the Tower of Hercules in Spain. That still stands with a lot of changes. Some people say the first lighthouse on the North American continent was at St. Augustine, built by the Spanish, but the watchtower established there in the 1500s was really a watchtower, so they would light a flame to warn of approaching enemy, that type of thing. We don't think it was used for navigation, so it can't really be considered a lighthouse. The Cordouan Lighthouse in France, which still stands today, built in 1611. There was a lighthouse in Brazil, and then the famous Eddystone Light in England. So I may be missing one or two, but this is most of the lighthouses that were standing before Boston Light was established. So here's another early map of Boston. By the late 1600s, there were some early beacons in the Boston area. There was a beacon at Point Allerton and Hull, which is just across the channel there from Boston Light. And it probably looks something like the picture on the right there. It was what they called it was an iron basket holding, they called it fire bales of pitch and ochre. So there were no lighthouses before Boston Light. You will see some references to beacons in the area, but I don't think you can call any of them lighthouses. By the early 1700s, Boston was a major port by that time. Lumber, salted fish, and rum were being shipped from Boston, and fully constructed ships were being built and leaving Boston Harbor. Shipbuilding was a major thing as well. And goods from England and other places were coming into the harbor. So it was a very busy place. In 1701, something called Clow's New England Almanac asked the question whether or not a lighthouse at Alderton's Point, meaning what we call Point Allerton in Hull, may not be of great benefit to mariners coming on these coasts, question mark. This is a 1722 map when they referred to Boston Neck because all that land hadn't been filled in, and Boston was almost an island with a narrow neck leading onto it. So in 1713, a local merchant, a Boston merchant named John George, he was also a selectman. And by the way, George's Island in Boston Harbor, where Fort Warren is, was named for John George. So he was a very prominent merchant, and he petitioned the General Court of Massachusetts to build a lighthouse, quote, for the direction of ships and vessels in the nighttime bound into the said harbor, unquote. And yet another early map let's see, sorry. I lost myself in my notes here. So George was considered a well-accomplished merchant and quote, a good Christian, desirable, useful man. And he actually died in 1714 before the lighthouse was built. And just a little bit of trivia, his widow married the Reverend Cotton Mather, the very famous minister in Boston, after George died. So the Boston Light bill was passed soon after that. The committee actually chose what they called the southernmost part of Great Brewster Island, called Beacon Island, which is what we know now as Little Brewster, is recommended as the site for the lighthouse. And I'm going to move my cursor here so you can see in the outer harbor here, Great Brewster and Beacon Isle connected by a sandbar. So again, sometimes it was considered all one island. So on July 23rd, 1715, the General Court of Massachusetts passed the Boston Light Bill. And as you can see on the screen here, it read in part, be it enacted that there be a lighthouse erected at the charge of the province on the southernmost part of the Great Brewster called Beacon Island to be kept lighted from sun setting to sun rising, which pretty typical. A lot of early lighthouse bills read pretty much like that. And that was always the number one thing for a lighthouse keeper was that light had to be on from sunset to sunrise, absolutely no matter what. This is one of our earliest drawings we have of Boston Light. The first lighthouse was financed by a tax of a penny a ton on all the vessels coming into the harbor, and also the same on vessels leaving the harbor. So a 50-foot stone tower was built at a cost of 2,385 pounds, first lighted with tallow candles, and soon after that it was changed to whale oil lamps. First lighted September 16th, 1716. The first keeper was a local man named George Worthylake. He had a farm on Lovell's Island farther in the harbor. He was 43 years old, and he and his wife had 5 children, but some of them were grown by the time he came here. So their 2 youngest daughters lived with them on Little Brewster Island. There was also a family servant named George Cutler, and 2 slaves, and African slaves. Sadly, we know really nothing about them. Shadwell, a male slave, and Dinah, a female slave. Here's another very early picture of Boston Light, one of the earliest drawings with a sloop in front of it, a British sloop. So in 1718, well, let me back up for a second. The colonial government paid Worthylake next to nothing. They paid him 50 pounds a year when he started. Eventually it was raised to 75 pounds a year. And I looked at one of these tables online, and it said that 50 pounds would be equal today to $13,000 a year. And when he got his raise, it would be about $19,000. So basically it was a not very good paying part-time job type of salary. So he had to do extra things to make ends meet. He was a harbor pilot for vessels coming into the harbor. He would row his boat out and help lead them into the harbor. He made extra money for that. Tried having a flock of sheep for a while. That went very badly. He had a flock of, I think it was 49 sheep, if I remember right. And one day, he had them on Great Brewster Island. And one day, all the sheep wandered out on a sand spit at low tide. And you can imagine what happened when the tide came in. Unfortunately, that was the end of his sheep. So, Worthy Lake really had pretty miserable luck. Had kind of a short, not very pleasant career as a lighthouse keeper, sadly. And then November 1718, Worthy Lake went into Boston to pick up his pay, but he went in with his wife and one of their two daughters and the family servant, George Cutler. And they went in on Sunday. They attended church, stayed overnight. He picked up his pay on Monday morning, and in the afternoon, they were traveling back to Boston Light. He picked up a family friend at Lovell's Island, where he had his farm. They anchored off of Boston Light in a sloop, probably similar to the one in this picture here. And Shadwell, the slave, paddled a canoe out to meet the landing party. 6 people crowded into the canoe as he was paddling back. No storm, no big waves or anything. As the Worthy Lake's other daughter and a friend were watching from the island, the canoe capsized and all 6 drowned. And this is still one of the worst lighthouse tragedies in American history. This is an affidavit for the coroner when they were looking into what had happened. It's pretty hard to read this. It's too much work to read the whole thing. But the last part says, if you look where it's signed, William Cook, I think, just above that, it says that they drank very friendly on board, though not to excess. This person saw the sloop coming back to Boston Light, and apparently they were kind of partying and drinking on it. But he said not to the degree that the alcohol played any part in what happened in the tragedy. Anyway, this was big front page news of its day. Here's the triple gravestone of George, Ann, and Ruth Worthy Lake. It's in the Cops Hill Burying Ground in Boston's North End. You see George on the left and his wife Anne on the right, daughter Ruth in the middle. It's one of those kind of spooky looking old gravestones with the so-called death's heads on it. There's a bunch of interesting footnotes to this story. One is that Cotton Mather, the famous minister who I mentioned earlier, preached a sermon about this. The young man who carved this gravestone subsequently married the Worthy Lake's surviving daughter, which I think is great. At least something positive came out of it. But there's a couple other things as well. Let me show you. This is Maurice Babcock Jr. He was the son of a longtime keeper of Boston Light, who I'll talk about in a few minutes. And in 1940, Maurice Jr. Was a teenager at the time, and he was exploring one of the other islands in the outer harbor. And he found a piece of paper with a poem handwritten on it. And somebody, actually it was Edward Rowe Snow, the popular historian, who said, "Oh, you found Franklin's poem." But it was not, well, let me back up for a moment. I haven't actually said. Benjamin Franklin was 12 years old and living in Boston at the time, and he wrote a poem about the tragedy called The Lighthouse Tragedy. And he, again, was 12 years old. His brother printed copies of it, and young Ben Franklin sold copies on the streets of Boston. There were no known copies of that poem, so nobody knew exactly what he wrote. Franklin himself referred to it in his autobiography as wretched stuff. So anyway, 1940, Maurice Babcock Jr., exploring an abandoned house on one of the outer harbor islands, found a copy of the poem, apparently, but again, it wasn't an original copy. It was something somebody had transcribed probably many years later. And you can see the typed copy in the middle here. That's a transcription of what Babcock found. So this may or may not be exactly what Franklin wrote, but you can see why, if you read any of it, you can see why Franklin referred to it himself as wretched stuff. Read towards the end. Quick the prow is upward borne, George and Anne's arms is thrown, husband, wife, and child together to the chilly waves have gone, etc. And he also, Franklin took great liberties. I mean, this really has nothing to do with what actually happened. if Franklin did write this, that is, but it makes it a very dramatic story as opposed to just the canoe capsizing. So anyway, that's another one of the interesting footnotes to all this. But another one is that Robert Saunders, who was sent out to be the next keeper replacing Worthy Lake at Boston Light, also drowned just a few days after taking the job. And let me show you a bit of a newspaper clipping from that time. So Saunders and two friends, you see it says Captain Saunders with Messieurs Braddock and Chamberlain, and they saw a ship coming into the harbor, and they went out to meet it and help it get into the harbor. But apparently it was very windy. It says they were overset by a flaw, it looks like, I'm not quite sure, of wind, and two of the men drowned, including Saunders, the new keeper of the lighthouse. So people started to wonder if the island was cursed. In 1719, the keeper at Boston Light at the time was John Hayes, and he requested a, quote, great gun to answer ships in a fog, he said. Ships, a lot of the ships coming through would have cannons on them, and it was kind of traditional for them to blast a cannon, just not to fire a cannonball, but to blast some powder. And others on shore or wherever, or in other vessels, would blast a cannon so they could would help tell their location in a fog. But there was nothing at Boston Light, so Hayes requested a cannon to be at Boston Light, and it was installed in 1719, the very first fog signal on the North American continent, and it was in use for 132 years. I'll say more about it in a while. Robert Ball was a keeper for 41 years, the longest serving keeper in the history of Boston Light, and he was assisted by a slave named Sampson. I don't know of any other slaves with the early keepers, but there may have been others as well. Sampson, by the way, the slave, died in 1762, and he's buried on Rainsford Island, one of the other harbor islands. So the lighthouse was badly damaged by fire 3 times in its early history. In those days, of course, they used, in the really early days, I think they were using fish oil for a while, which was very flammable, and then whale oil. The installation of a lightning rod in the lighthouse was delayed because some viewed it as, quote, vanity and irreligion to presume to avert the stroke of heaven, unquote. So that's why it didn't get a lightning rod for a very long time, but finally did get one. So during the American Revolution, Boston Harbor, of course, in the early part of the Revolution, was under British occupation. On July 20th, 1775, American troops under Major Joseph Vose landed on the island. This is while the British controlled it. The Americans landed there and burned the wooden parts of the tower, and then they outran a British schooner and escaped. As the British repaired the tower, 300 American soldiers under Major Benjamin Tupper landed on July 31st. They defeated the British guards and set fire to the lighthouse, but they were trapped by low tide. Cannon fire from Nantasket helped the Americans escape, and only one was killed. I believe there are several British casualties. General George Washington praised the men in a letter. I'll read you a little bit of what General Washington wrote. He said, quote, "The general thanks Major Tupper and the officers and soldiers under his command for their gallant and soldier-like behavior in possessing themselves of the enemy's post at the lighthouse," unquote. When the last British ships left Boston Harbor in the spring of 1776, one of the very last things they did was to set a time charge. They set up some dynamite that destroyed the lighthouse. Left just a little bit standing, and a new 60-foot rubble stone tower was built on the same site in 1783. And I'll just mention that usually people have said that the lighthouse, the original lighthouse, was completely destroyed and the British blew it up. But not too many years ago, when there was a major restoration of the lighthouse, they removed all the coatings on the outside, and it was found that the lowest, approximately 15 feet, were much smaller stones and laid more irregularly in a way that made people think that the bottom I think it's going around, it's like 9 to 15 feet, that is part of the original lighthouse. So apparently they kept some of the original and just rebuilt the tower on top of that. So August 7th, 1789, the federal government, under the Treasury Department, took over the management of our lighthouses. At the beginning of that, the Secretary of the Treasury, Alexander Hamilton, was in charge of our lighthouses, and it remained under the Treasury Department and under the Commerce Department right up to 1939 when the Coast Guard took over. This is a clipping I found. I just thought I'd throw it in. This is from 1797. And if you read it, it says a very remarkable fish was caught near the lighthouse at Boston, measuring nearly 14 feet in length and has been seen by a great many persons, none of which were able to give it a name. I love that. I can't imagine what it was. I'm thinking maybe some sort of a shark. I don't know. Maybe a sturgeon, possibly. If somebody has ideas, maybe you could put it in the chat a little later, and we can see if we can figure out what that fish was. So this is Winslow Lewis. If any of you are lighthouse history buffs, you know about Winslow Lewis. He's often regarded as kind of a villain in lighthouse history. He built some of our early lighthouses, and he also eventually got the contract to provide the lighting apparatus in lighthouses for a few decades. And his apparatus was not very efficient. Later, they were replaced by the more efficient glass Fresnel lenses, mostly from France. But he kind of had a monopoly on the lighting systems for a while. And one of his first tests was at Boston Light in 1810. He installed a new system of 6 argon-style whale oil lamps. See basically a diagram of what he did there on the right. Each lamp was backed by a parabolic reflector, which would have been coated with silver, in theory to reflect the light, to reflect a powerful light, but in actuality, it kind of scattered the light and wasn't very efficient at all. But on the basis of this experiment, Lewis was given the contract to provide the lighting apparatus for, as I said, for American lighthouses for the next few decades. On June 1st, 1813, the keeper of Boston Light, Jonathan Bruce, and his wife Lydia watched the American frigate Chesapeake battle the British ship Shannon in the War of 1812. The Chesapeake was defeated, but not before the mortally wounded Captain James Lawrence said famously, "Don't give up the ship." This is a painting of that battle. Just a little story that in the 1840s, I don't have much detail, but it was said that there was a so-called cigar factory on the island. I'm not sure whether the keeper was running it or exactly how that worked, but anyway, girls were brought in from Boston and were making cigars on the island. The cigars would be labeled Cuban and sold to unsuspecting people in the area. And the keeper was dismissed, so I guess he did have a hand in it when the operation was discovered. That was the end of the keeper's job. So 1839, Winslow Lewis installed a new lantern and new reflectors. And then in 1843, his nephew, I.W.P. Lewis, interesting dynamic. Again, if you study lighthouse history, you know that there was a battle between Winslow Lewis and his nephew, I.W.P. Lewis. I.W.P. Lewis wrote a very important report to Congress in 1843, and he called about all our lighthouses. He kind of wrote about the state of America's lighthouses. He called Boston Light loose and leaky, and he noted that the stairs were unsafe of ascent, he said. So in 1844, a new cast iron spiral stairway was installed, and a fog bell, 1,375-pound fog bell, replaced the cannon in 1851. In 1859, this beautiful duplex house you see here was built, and at the same time, the tower was lined with brick, and a new entryway building was attached to the tower. And the tower was raised in height, also in 1859, to 89 feet. You can see the lower part is, most of the tower is stone, but that upper part just under the lantern, which is the iron part, where the light is, just below that is a 15-foot extension that was added at that time that was made of brick. And a new second-order Fresnel lens was installed. I'll say more about that in a little while. And at that time, the lighthouse was assigned a principal keeper and two assistants to keep the light and the fog signal going. And the two assistants lived, actually, I'm going to back up for a second there. Actually, I think it was a little bit later they got two assistants. So at this time, the head keeper and an assistant keeper lived in this duplex house with their families. Later, they added another house and had that became the head keeper's house, and the assistants and their families lived in this one. So here's the lens, and I'm going to play a little video that I took a few years ago of the lens rotating. Our lighthouse buffs in the audience know all about Fresnel lenses, I'm sure. That's capital Fresnel, after Augustin Fresnel, the French scientist who invented these in the early 1820s. Most of these beautiful lenses were made in France by a few different companies. Some were made by the Chance brothers in England, and one company in Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania made some, but the vast majority of our Fresnel lenses came from France. So this is a second order, meaning second to the largest and most powerful kind that was size that was made. First order were extremely powerful, about 9 feet tall. This is a bit smaller than that, but it's a rotating lens, as you can see. And the round panels, so-called flash panels or bullseye panels, create a flash as it rotates around the light source. So the basic idea behind these is that the multiple prisms serve to focus and magnify that light into a very powerful horizontal beam. So at night, when this light revolved first around whale oil lamps and then a kerosene lamp and eventually electricity, it would be visible, and still is visible, for more than 20 nautical miles on a clear night. And probably in times in its history was visible as far as like 27 miles. So this is Thomas Bates, who was keeper for 29 years. I believe he was the second longest serving keeper at Boston Light. January 31st, 1882, Bates and his assistant rescued the crew of a ship called the Fanny Pike that was wrecked on Shag Rocks, which is a dangerous area near Boston Light. It was wrecked in a snowstorm, and they went out and rescued the crew. An interesting thing about the Bates era is that sing-alongs were very popular with the keepers and families, and the assistant keeper, Edward Gorham, was supposed to be really good on the accordion, so he played the accordion during their sing-alongs. I think typically they would be singing hymns for the most part. In 1884, a brick cistern building was added that held 21,800 gallons of water, would collect rainwater into the cistern for keepers and their families. This is an early postcard from the early 1900s. You see the fog signal building to the right of the tower there with the chimney on it. This would be from the era when they had a steam-driven foghorn, and the keepers would have to shovel coal into a boiler to get that running. So they needed obviously a chimney to vent the steam from some of the steam from that. 1872, compressed air fog trumpet replaced a fog bell. Then in 1887, a steam-driven siren. Students from MIT were brought out. I think it was, not sure if I forget if it was late 1800s or early 1900s. They brought some students from MIT out to conduct experiments, and they tried to perfect a fog signal that would penetrate the so-called ghost walk about 6 miles to the east of the lighthouse. I don't think they ever figured that out. There was an area, like a dead area, where it just couldn't be heard. And I think that's still the case, although the horn's not nearly as powerful now, so I don't think you can hear it for 6 miles. There's now a modern electric foghorn there. So this second house, was built on the island in 1885, and this one is still there. This was the principal keeper's house, so you had a principal keeper and his family living here, and two assistant keepers and their families living in that duplex house. On the left here is Charles Jennings. He was keeper for 3 years. And with him in this picture is Edward Rowe Snow. And I'm sure we have some people in the audience who remember Edward Rowe Snow. Very popular historian. He was from the town of Winthrop. He lived in Marshfield on the South Shore. Wrote more than 40 full-length books and a lot of shorter ones. And was always on Boston radio and TV. When I was growing up in Lynn, I just loved hearing his stories. I got to meet him a couple of times, so he was a big influence on me. And he knew all the lighthouse keepers in the area, so he's visiting with Charles Jennings here. Jennings, after he was at Boston Light, went on to become keeper at the Lovell's Island Range Lights farther in the harbor for 20 years. And his son wrote a book called The Lighthouse Family about their life there. It's a really good book. Jennings at Boston Light was renowned for the rescue of 24 men from a Navy patrol boat called the Alacrity, and put himself in danger to rescue the men off that ship, or boat, I should say. This is John Leland Hart with his wife, and he was keeper at Boston Light, principal keeper for 7 years till 1926. And then he became a keeper at the Spectacle Island Range Lights in the Inner Harbor. And when he retired, I actually have a newspaper clipping framed on my wall. When he retired, the headline said, Keeper retires, never really liked it anyway. That's what he said. They asked him how he felt about retiring, and he said, well, I never really liked it anyway, which I think is pretty hilarious because in general, I think lighthouse keeping was less romantic as people think, but most keepers found reasons to love some aspects of it, but I guess he never felt that way. But he did it for quite a few years, so there must have been something good he got out of it. He's in the typical lighthouse service uniform in this picture, by the way, with the hat with the lighthouse insignia on it. And it's hard to see, but it would have the letter K on the lapels of the jacket. You can kind of see that there. This is his name was Archford, but better known as Ted Haskins. He had a long career in the lighthouse service, and he was later keeper at both two lighthouses in Nantucket, Sankaty Headlight and Great Point Light, and he was also keeper for a while at Owl's Head Light in Maine. And you can see he had, I'm trying to think of how many kids it was, 7, I believe. And I've actually met a couple of them. His wife, Betty, said that she would bring a bucket of water from the cistern and heat it on the stove, and they would wash their clothes with a washboard and lye soap. So, you did the best you could with what you had. The family would can food to have it in the winter, and they said that corn chowder was a staple. So, of course, the fish was certainly plentiful, and lobster and so forth. This is Maurice Babcock, another one of the longest serving keepers of Boston Light, 15 years. And another one who had a pretty long career in the lighthouse service. For a while, he was an assistant keeper at Thatcher Island off Rockport, Mass, before he came to Boston Light. So I mentioned earlier that the Coast Guard took over management of lighthouses in 1939. The civilian keepers were given the option of joining the Coast Guard or serving out their career as civilians. Babcock chose to remain a civilian, so when he retired in 1941, he was the last civilian keeper of Boston Light. He's inside the second order Fresnel lens here, tinkering with an incandescent oil vapor lamp, a kerosene lamp. And like a lot of lighthouse keepers, he was kind of modest and, certainly didn't see himself as a hero, didn't like to talk about his job that much. In 1934, there was a gathering on the island, and he was asked to make a speech. And this on the screen is the entire text of his speech. Well, ladies and gentlemen, I'm not much of an orator, but I enjoy keeping the light burning for the ships coming in and the fog signal sounding. I thank you. So, what more is there to say? But I interviewed his son, Maurice Jr., a couple of times back in the 1980s. And I'm actually going to play you a little clip here. So there's a picture of the Babcock family with Boston Light in the background there. He's in his lighthouse service uniform, and he and his wife had 5 kids. And again, I interviewed Maurice Jr., who was living at the time way up in Lubec, Maine, way up the Maine coast. I'm going to play you a little clip from with Maurice talking about his life as a teenager at Boston Light. In the Globe article, you said something, you mentioned how you used to go to Great Brewster Island to play ball.
Oh, yeah. That was the bigger island across there. We had baseball games out there. In the water was out. There were a lot of kids on the other islands during the summer. Summer people used to lease land and build cottages. And then there's quite a few children on Boston Light. And during the summer months, we all played together as one big gang. We had rowing races and baseball games and bonfires, and it was just one day after another. So many things to do, but there wasn't enough time to do them in.
I hope you can hear that. Mina, please tell me if you can't hear
I
the
could
audio.
hear it. My volume was a little bit low, but I could definitely hear it.
Okay, good, thank you. I've got a few more clips, and the volume might vary a little bit, but I think it's as loud as I could get it on this end. And here is a picture of three keepers at Boston Light. In 1934, they unveiled a plaque with the names of the keepers on it. And that is J. Leland Hart, the one who said when he retired that he never really liked it anyway, and Charles Jennings and Maurice Babcock. And the man unveiling the plaque was named Fitzhenry Smith. He was a local historian who wrote a short book on Boston Light. And here's another neat picture of those three keepers on that occasion right in front of the lighthouse tower there. And here's Maurice Sr. again. I'm going to play you a little clip of his son talking about what happened in the hurricane of 38. Just to set it up, of course, the hurricane of September 21st, 1938, worst hurricane in recorded New England history. About 700 people died, mostly on the south coast of Rhode Island and Connecticut, and a little bit of southeastern Massachusetts. But it did tremendous damage in a lot of New England, way up the coast. And at Boston Light, the wind was blowing so hard that it blew the door open to the lighthouse. And I think it may have actually kind of pulled it off its hinges, and they just couldn't get the door closed. So let me play you this clip of Maurice Jr. talking about what happened.
Because it was getting to be a half hour before sunset, and that light had to be lighted. When they got up there, the wind was blowing so strong up through the tower, just like a chimney, that a big steel trap door blew open. And one of the keepers they got up through, closed the steel trap door, and one of the keepers, either my father or Archford, I don't know which, they had to stand on the steel door to keep it from blowing open. And the other keeper replaced the mantle, which had been blown apart, and pumped up the pressure and went through the lighting procedure of the light. And when they opened the hatch or opened the trap door to go back down the ladder, it blew the light out and blew the mantle all to pieces. So they relit it again, and they had to stay up there till the wind receded, which I don't know just how long that took, so that the light would stay lit. The foghorn was blowing. Mr. Norwood was on watching the fog signal, and the two keepers were in the tower. And of course they had a good view. They could tell that the houses were holding together and that there was no danger down below. And as this story is being related to me, I asked my dad, what was the sense of lighting that light and staying up there in that no one could see it? And his answer was that a half hour before sunset, the light will be lit. That's our job, and it was lit. And that's how they looked at their job.
Yeah, again, that absolutely, that light had to be lit sunset to sunrise, no matter what. But if anybody was out there in a boat in that hurricane, they were beyond the help of a lighthouse. But I'll also mention that I was at the National Archives, and I got out the logbook that Maurice Babcock kept at that time. So I looked at the entry he did for the day of the hurricane. And all he said was no detail, just high wind and rain. Didn't say anything about what they did or, any detail at all about what happened there. So it began pretty typical. They certainly didn't see themselves as heroes. I'm going to play you a real quick part of a newsreel here about Boston Light. You're going to see a little film of Maurice Babcock here.
The U.S. Lighthouse Service is combining with the Coast Guard after 2 centuries of duty well done. The old cannon sounded fog warnings at Boston Light nearly 200 years ago. It's the oldest lighthouse in the U.S., built in 1716. Her lights have been dimmed only twice in her long career of guiding seafarers into the safety of Boston Harbor.
So sorry, I think the sound might be a little soft on that, but I hope you could hear it. But it's just really neat, even though it's very short, seeing a little bit of film of Maurice Babcock on the job. Here he is again at the time of his retirement, October 1941. Edward Grosvenor went out and was with him that day and wrote about it in one of his books. He said, quote, "It was a sad journey we made that afternoon, and as we reached the lantern room, he looked fondly at the lenses and the lighting apparatus with its gas mantle, all of which he would never see again. Then Maurice Babcock, 25th keeper of Boston Light, stepped out on the platform that surrounds the tower and looked out to sea," which is what you see in this picture here. "Neither of us spoke, but each knew what was in the other's mind. The old days of the lighthouse service were gone forever, never to return. We're gone forever, never to return," unquote. So that was the end of civilians of Boston Light, and the Coast Guard took over. The light was blacked out during World War II, as were most of the lighthouses on the East Coast, so they wouldn't aid any enemy vessels along the coast. On the West Coast, they were blacked out because of the threat of Japanese vessels on the West Coast. The light was converted to electricity in 1948. Whoops, I should have put this on as I was saying that. But in this picture, that's a beautiful picture of the that duplex house that sadly is no longer there. So here's Ralph Norwood, who was an assistant to Maurice Babcock from 29 to 41, and then served as the principal keeper under the Coast Guard from 41 to 45. So Norwood is one of those keepers who joined the Coast Guard when they took over. So he became the first Coast Guard keeper of Boston Light. You see him with his wife Josephine here. And Ralph and Josephine had 9 kids, all born before Josephine was 30, which is pretty amazing. But she lived to be 100. I actually got to meet her, and she lived to be 100. She passed away, I think, about 10 years ago now, and the last of the Norwood siblings has passed away in recent years as well. Here is Ralph Norwood inside that second order Fresnel lens. His grandson, Willie Emerson, wrote a short book called First Light about his family's stay at Boston Light. And he interviewed his grandfather, I believe it was in the 1980s, on audio tape. And I'm going to play you a clip. He was asked, "Can you describe the duties of a lighthouse keeper?" So I've got the words on the screen because it can be a little hard to understand. But I'm going to play you a recording of Ralph Norwood here.
All our jobs were doing carpenter work, shingling roofs, painting. We had to paint all the buildings and whitewash the tower and whitewash the signal house and run the fog signal. And had to stay awake all night, of course. Somebody had to be awake all night to see that the light didn't go out or have any trouble with it. And if it came in fog, we had to start the fog signal going. Oh, it was a working job just like any other job.
He was from Maine, in case you couldn't tell. It was a working job, just like any other job. Love the way he says that. He, again, very matter of fact about it. They didn't see themselves as any kind of heroes. So here's the Norwood family with 9 kids. This is actually later at a lighthouse in Maine where they were. And I'm going to read you a quote from an article where Josephine Norwood was talking about life at Boston Light. She said, quote, "The days spent on Boston Light were busy ones with 11 of us to cook for, as we never knew when inspection of the houses, tower, and fog signal would be held. It was a matter of course to have the beds made, the dishes done, and the sweeping and dry mopping done by 10 o'clock. Of course, our children were brought up to help with the work. Then they had time to go to swim, to go fishing, walking over the bar at low tide, or go rowing," unquote. So I actually arranged a kind of a family reunion out at the lighthouse in 1991. Had members of the Norwood family and the Babcock family and Harold Jennings, son of Keeper Charles Jennings. And so I got to talk to a bunch of these Norwood siblings. Most of them really loved it. And the summer was like their glorious time. They boarded with families on the mainland to go to school. They'd be out on the island all summer and sometimes for school vacations, maybe weekends. But summer was really the best time. Again, lots of fishing and rowing and exploring forts and abandoned buildings on the harbor islands and playing games with the kids who lived on the other islands and so forth. So you made your own fun at a place like this. That's there were no cell phones or video games or TV or much of anything else. So the first child born at Boston Light in its history was Georgia Norwood, born in April 1932. The story goes that Georgia Norwood was about to have a baby and appeared to go into labor. Ralph called a doctor from the town of Hull. There was a storm going on. The doctor got a boat ride, but the waves and wind were so bad, the seas were so high that they couldn't land the boat. They had to turn around and go back to Hull. But as it turned out, it was false labor. The baby was not born that night. She was born a week later in calm weather. But because the doctor went out in a storm, it made headlines. They called her the Storm Child. And a novelist named Ruth Carman wrote the book. You see the cover on the right there, Storm Child. Very loosely based on reality. It's not a history book. The only true thing is that she was born on the island. The climax of the book has a tidal wave destroying Boston Light, but it's a fun book. And some people in Hollywood thought this would make a good movie, so I believe they had a screenplay written, and Georgia was going to play herself in the movie. They had radio appearances and stuff, really playing it up. And on the night before Georgia was supposed to fly out to California to make the movie, they say that she went to her parents and she was crying and she said, "I don't want to go to Hollywood. I want to stay at Boston Light." So her mother thought better of it. She never went, and the movie was never made. So we'll never get to see it, sadly. But I guess they couldn't afford Shirley Temple. There's Georgia with her father, Ralph, Keeper Ralph Norwood. And I'm going to play you a little video clip here of Josephine Norwood talking about all that.
April the 11th, 1932.
And what happened on April 4th? A week before?
A week before, well, I thought she'd be gone then, and she wasn't. It was just
False. But it was a stormy
false
night,
labor
wasn't it?
pains, yeah. And the doctor tried to land, and of course he couldn't on account it was a storm and real bad weather. So he had to turn around, go back to Hull. But the next week she was born, everything was okay. There was
Storm Child.
Yeah, Storm Child. The author, Ruth Carman, she had written other books, and she heard about Georgia and wanted to write a life story and have her in the movies. And I had other children. I couldn't just pick out, and I wouldn't let them have Georgia. So she would have taken it to Hollywood, but it wasn't for her. Maybe she thinks differently now, but I couldn't part the family.
And I apologize if there was any trouble hearing that. Might have been a little soft. But here's the book written by Ralph and Josephine's grandson, Willie Emerson, son of Georgia Norwood Emerson. And a little hard to find copies of this now, but if you can find it, it's a fun read. It's all about the Norwood family's years at Boston Light. The keeper in this picture, James Freeman, was a keeper actually at some Maine lighthouses, but the person I want to talk about here is his daughter, Maisie, who is on the left side of the picture there, is a little kid. Maisie married, well, she grew up at lighthouses in Maine, but then she married a Coast Guard lightkeeper named Russell Anderson, and he became the Coast Guard keeper at Boston Light in 1947. She later wrote an article for Yankee Magazine about her life at lighthouses. And she had some interesting stories about Boston Light, some weird stories. She said one day she was walking along the shore. She said she heard footsteps close behind her. Nobody was there when she turned around. That night, as she tried to sleep, Maisie felt a presence in the room. Later, she heard what she described as horrible maniacal laughter coming from the boathouse. On another night, she heard the same sound coming from the fog signal house. But this time she heard a little girl sobbing and crying out, "Shadwell, Shadwell," over and over. So Maisie had no idea what that meant until she was researching the history of Boston Light later, and she discovered that the slave who died along with the Worthy Lakes in that canoe accident was Shadwell. So she kind of surmised that she was hearing a replay of that event, hearing the little girl crying out for Shadwell. So interesting. You can make of it what you want, but this is not my ghost story lecture, so I won't say any more about that. Here's Joseph Levine, who was a Coast Guard keeper from 48 to 50. He and his wife had the second child ever born on the island. It was their fifth child. He had joined the Coast Guard as a teenager. He was aboard a vessel called the USS Menzies when it was torpedoed near Algeria in 1944. He installed the first bathroom on the island in 1949 at his wife's request. So his wife, Mary Ellen, who you see here holding the baby, had the child born on the island in March 1950. And when the baby's birth was imminent, low tide prevented the keeper from launching a boat to get his wife to the mainland. So a doctor was rushed over from Hull in a Coast Guard boat, and Joseph E. Levine was delivered at 7:30 a.m. She was taken to Quincy Hospital to recuperate. So again, I think I said 5 kids. I believe he was their 4th kid. They're all in this picture here. And here are some, I've been in touch with a couple of members of the Levine family who gave me these pictures. You see the baby Joseph born on the island on the fog cannon there on the lower right. The cannon, by the way, was there. Well, I'll hold that thought. I'm going to say more about it in a minute. So going up to 1952, a 22, whoops, let me back up here, 22-year-old Coast Guardsman and Newton, Mass native, Richard Freedy was stationed on the lighthouse. And he one day traveled in one of the station's 14-foot boats. He was headed for Hull, and it was a 5-horsepower outboard motor on the boat. With him was Wilford McNeil, a 53-year-old contractor who was doing some work on the island. They were last seen in Hull around 3:30 a.m. on November 21st. They were supposed to return in the morning. They didn't. There was a search, an intensive search. McNeil, the contractor, his body was found, but Freedy was never found. Of course, he was presumed dead. He left his wife and a 6-month-old daughter, as you see in this picture, and McNeil left a wife and 2 children. So Jill Freedy, the daughter here, was just a baby. And when her father was born, she contacted me several years ago and said she had never been on Boston Lights since she was a baby. She didn't remember ever being there. So I actually arranged for her to go out as part of a group. I think it was 2016. And I believe you see me leaning against the railing there towards the left side of the picture, and behind me in yellow, that's Jill Freedy, so this is the first time she ever got on the island since she was a baby, since her father died. So it was kind of an emotional day for her. In the center front right is Sally Snowman, the keeper of Boston Light, but I'll hold off on saying anything about her until I get to her in a minute or two here. So the duplex house, that beautiful big duplex house, sadly, in 1960, the Coast Guard decided they didn't need it anymore, because by that time they only had male Coast Guard keepers living out there, no families. So and they didn't need all that space. The other house they felt was plenty. So and this house had badly deteriorated. So it was razed. It was set on fire. I actually talked to the Coast Guard officer who ordered that, and he said they waited until a foggy day so people from the mainland couldn't see it, because they didn't want people getting too alarmed. So on a foggy day, they burned down the house. So too bad. It was a really beautiful house. Mike Michelonis, who's the guy on the right here, was the Coast Guard keeper from 1962 to 67. I don't know who the man in the middle is, but the one on the right left is Ken Black, who some people might know who he was. He was known as Mr. Lighthouse. He was the commander in several different Coast Guard stations over the years. He was in charge at Point Allerton and Hull, the Coast Guard station at the time of this picture. He later was the founder of the Maine Lighthouse Museum in Rockland, Maine. So Michelonis, again, was there for 5 years. At those days, the Coast Guard keepers would spend 2 weeks on the island and a week off, so they would kind of rotate 3 or 4 keepers. There'd usually be at least 2 men on the island. When Michelonis retired in 1967, he said that he had caught more than 1,000 striped bass, 2 of them more than 50 pounds. That is a big bass, over 50 pounds. When he retired, he was presented with the bulb, or lamp, that burned in the tower on his last day of duty. He shared the island with, besides the other keepers, two assistant keepers. There was a shaggy black dog named Salty, one of a long line of Boston dogs. This is a quick video clip here of Edward O. Snow as Santa and his daughter Dolly. And there's Ken Black again, who was the Coast Guard commander in the harbor at that time. And Edward O. Snow lived in Winthrop. He was the flying Santa for more than 40 years. He would drop presents out of a plane for keepers. But because he was so close to Boston Light, sometimes he would visit, as you see there. And you saw some of the dogs on the pier. Some of the, again, long history of a lot of different dogs on the island. In fact, here is Farah, a dog that I got to know in the late 80s when I was going out there a lot. Farah was pretty old by that time, and she would kind of waddle out and meet boats and, just give her approval and waddle back to the house. And that's a quick video clip of Farah on the upper right, and a cat who was there at that time named Ida Lewis, after the very famous woman keeper from Newport, Rhode Island. So a lot of animals that lived on Boston Light over the years. Believe it or not, this is me in the late 80s, just a few years and a few hairs ago. And I remember it was early morning. I can't remember exactly why it was happening, but I went out with the Coast Guard that day, and they made me wear the survival suit. But I think it's one of my favorite pictures of myself because it brings back so many memories. This is Dennis Dever, who I got to know, who was one of the last Coast Guard keepers at Boston Light. He was there 88 to 90, and it looked like he was going to be the last keeper in the country because the plan was to automate Boston Light and de-staff it by 1990. He loved being a keeper. He loved they thought he was going to be the last keeper in the country, and he kind of loved that role. I interviewed him in the Lantern in the summer of '89. I'm just going to play you a quick clip here.
It's a nice environment in the evening when the wind's howling, the snow's flying, and the sea's roaring against the rocks outside your window. Just to sit there in the living room, maybe read Edgar Allan Poe book or something like that. That's what I enjoy doing.
Again, Dennis just loved being a lighthouse keeper and loved a good storm out there. Told me some ghost stories too, but that's for another day. But as it turned out, he was not the last keeper because legislation was passed in October '89, led by Senator Ted Kennedy. And I actually got to be on the island on October 23rd, '89, when the legislation was announced, a press conference with Senator Kennedy. And I'm the only person who videotaped that event. I'm going to play you a quick clip here. And the sun was behind them. That's why the picture is so lousy. It was impossible to get good video. But anyway, it was pretty cool being out there. So let me play you. Before I play the clip, just the gist of it is that the legislation said that there would the Coast Guard would keep a presence on the island, that they would have a keeper on the island, basically. So let's play a little bit from it.
Welcome Senator Kennedy especially, and I know he's got a few things he'd like to say to everyone that's here. Senator?
Admiral, some of us had the opportunity of being here just about 2 years ago when we were able to obtain some resources to be able to provide some of the important repairs to ensure the quality of this facility and the excellent work that is done by the light and the keepers and the Coast Guard and ensuring that this light is going to continue to be a beacon over the Boston Harbor.
So, because of that legislation, the Coast Guard kept Coast Guard personnel on the island for a few more years. I'm going to get to what happened after that in a moment, but I just want to show you the fog cannon. You see several of the Norwood kids back in this will be either late 30s or early 40s there, on the fog cannon. And then the cannon was brought back to the island after, for many years, being at the Coast Guard Academy in New London, Connecticut on the grounds, brought back by helicopter in '93, and was on display for years on the base of the lighthouse, as you see there. It's now kind of in storage, sadly, but there's no tours happening at Boston Light anyway, but hopefully in the future it'll get displayed nicely again. But as I said, the Coast Guard kept keepers out there a few more years, but then they decided they had other things for those keepers to be doing, and they hired a civilian keeper, the woman you see here, Sally Snowman. A good friend of mine. I've known her since the 80s when she was in the Coast Guard Auxiliary before she was a keeper. And she and her husband, Jay Thompson, for 20 years, didn't live out there all the time, but spent a lot of time out in the island. She supervised Coast Guard Auxiliary volunteers. She ran tours for a number of years, but I think it's close to 10 years ago now, the pier at Boston Light was pretty much destroyed in storms. So there hasn't been any haven't been any public tours out there in, I think pretty much close to a decade now. But still a very important job. The light has been automated for quite a while, so she didn't need to turn the light on or off or anything like that. In fact, it's on 24 hours. But keeping an eye on things and supervising the volunteers and everything. And she really got into the job, as you can see. She'd wear these period clothes, loved to wave a hanky to passing ships, and she's just a great person. I've had her on my podcast a couple of times. And I'm going to play you a 1-minute clip of Sally talking about, you'll hear me ask a question, and she talks about her feeling about being the keeper there. What is it like playing such an important role as you do in a location with such tremendous history that's played such a great role in the history and commerce of our nation? When you're out there, do you feel that a lot of the time, just as you walk around the island? Is that something you feel?
No. I see it as an honor to have this position, and I don't think in terms of the way that, I don't know how to say this. I personally don't think that Sally Snowman is important. The position is important.
Right.
And my job is to keep that place safe, keep the people safe that are out there, and to tell the story as historically correct as we can. And if that's giving Sally Snowman notoriety, I don't see it as that. I see that as the keeper doing that. I use the word humbling. I find this job very humbling. I don't feel it's an ego trip. If anybody thinks that my ego comes through, I am not aware of that, because I do my best not to get my ego involved in the keeper's position.
Mm-hmm. Makes a lot of sense to me. What's your favorite part of the job?
Sitting at the top of the tower with my feet dangling over the gallery, just watching the sunset or the sunrise, just watching the world go by.
So a good friend of mine, Dan May, retired Rear Admiral Dan May in the Coast Guard, had a lot to do with setting up the legislation in '89, and he's the one who actually hired Sally. And Sally retired at the end of 2023. Things have been in limbo for Boston Light for a while now. It's expected to go into the National Park Service. That hasn't happened yet. It keeps getting delayed. There is no intent to hire another keeper. Legislation was passed, again, Dan May being involved, so that there's no longer a human presence, a keeper required there. So it's not required by law at this point. And under the National Park Service, hopefully they should have somebody living there to keep an eye on things. I hope that happens. And I hope that tours will happen again out there. But Boston Light's been in limbo in recent years, and hopefully you'll see news, I hope, in the coming years. There is the Boston Harbor Islands National Park, and it makes logical sense for this to be part of it. So I got to spend a night on the couch at Boston Light a few years ago by invitation to Sally Snowman, and got to go out at night, take some pictures of that beautiful lens turning around, and it's quite a thrill to spend a night out there. So that brings me to the end. I just want to mention the podcast I do for the U.S. Lighthouse Society, Lighthearted. You can listen to any podcast app or just go to uslhs.org. You can hear it there. And my own website, newenglandlighthouses.net, U.S. Lighthouse Society. Again, I'm the historian for the society, uslhs.org. And I think I've spoken a little over an hour, and I know we want to take some questions. So Mina, should I come out of screen sharing, or how do you want to do this?
Yeah, let's go. Let's be on screen.
Okay, just give me a moment here. All right, here we go.
Awesome, great. So for people that are here, we're gonna continue talking with questions for the next maybe 20 minutes. So until about 8:30. So stick with us if you can. If not, we are recording it so you can watch it later. If you have questions, please put them in the Q&A, which is the button at the bottom of your screen. I'm going to keep the chat off just so that we can keep everything in the Q&A. And I see a lot of emojis going by, Jeremy. Obviously, everybody enjoyed that as much as I did. So I'm just going to start from the beginning, like of where people started asking questions and go one by one.
Sure.
How tall were the fire towers and how did they get the fire in them?
That's a tough question. I'm not quite that old, so I don't remember, but as they were varying heights. I mean, if you go back to the earliest days of navigation where people were first starting to venture out at night in small boats, like trying to think of who the first ones would have been, but anyway, like the Egyptians, they would just put fires on the beach, just low fires. And then they thought, wow, if we put this on top of like a pole or tower, it's going to be seen farther. So that's why they started doing that. And when they had those sort of baskets, I think they had systems for raising and lowering them, probably by rope or with a post that would kind of swing up into place, that sort of thing. But again, I'm no expert on those primitive lighthouses. But my guess would be they were the earliest ones were no more than 10 or 20 feet, maybe 20 feet high, something like that. Nowhere near the lighthouses that came later. So.
So at one point you had asked about the kind of fish that they might have
Yeah.
seen was somebody thought tuna and somebody thought oarfish. Those were the only suggestions. So
Yeah. Well, you'd think they'd recognize a tuna, but it's possible. Certainly that's one of the bigger fish in the area. But oarfish, I think those are pretty rare. I've seen pictures of them, but who knows? There were a lot more different kinds of fish, I think, in Boston Harbor back then than there are now. So, but thanks for the suggestions there.
were the Worth Lakes wealthy as they had a servant?
No, they're not at all. I mean, again, he was way underpaid and he had to do extra things to try to make a living. He had a farm on Lovell's Island, but they were not wealthy. But I don't think it was that uncommon to have servants. Maybe I don't know how long he was with the family, and I don't know if the servant, he may have been called a servant in name, but who knows? There were also the two slaves. The servant, I have no idea if he was paid or how much he was paid. But anyway, I think the answer would be no, they weren't wealthy. So I'm not sure exactly the situation with the servant.
I mean, it does sound from your talk that this is a labor of love, not of one to make a lot of money.
Well, the keepers were paid better later. I mean, that was by the colony of Massachusetts, the colonial government, but they were never paid really well. If you're talking about like the late 1800s, early 1900s, a lot of keepers were paid between $500 and $1,000 a year, which was a lot more money then than it is now, but still, it was like a sort of a lower middle class kind of salary. So it was never, you didn't get rich being a lighthouse keeper by any means. Yeah.
Oh, yeah, I can see that. Brian asks about the lenses. Were they brought up in sections? Because he's wondering how they get them up to the top if they aren't.
That's a really good question. Yeah, the larger lenses would have been taken apart and reassembled at the top of the lighthouse. And often, I don't know if they did it at Boston Light, but in a lot of the cases where they brought them over, they would bring them over from France in crates on ships, in pieces and then assemble them. And often the companies that made them, and like the El Sauté was one of there are a few different companies in Paris that made a lot of them. They would send somebody from the company along with the lens to help put it together on the other end, which is pretty cool. And I think sometimes American lighthouse officials actually went over to France to also accompany the lens back to make sure it was okay, because they would pay as much as $10,000 or $12,000 for one of these lenses in those days, which was a lot of money. So, it's a pretty high percentage of the cost of the whole lighthouse, just the lens. So, they would have brought it up in pieces and assembled it in the lantern room. Absolutely. Smaller lenses they could haul up on all in one piece, but not a big one like that.
Yeah. I wish IKEA did that.
Yeah.
Okay, just came to your house.
Send somebody to help you put it together. Yeah.
That's right. Claire asked a couple of questions, but I think you answered one of hers, so I'm going to go with this one. Was there any form of revolution for the top of the tower in the early lighthouses as there is now?
I'm sorry. form of revolving.
Revolving.
Well, in the early, yeah, the Boston Light has always had a, well, not always, but since the Fresnel lens was installed in 1859, it's rotated. So it sits on a setup it's called a system of chariot wheels that turn and turn it. So it's been electric for a long time, since the late 40s. But before that, there was a weight system, like a clockwork type weights, with weights hanging down. You've got a spiral stairway in the tower, and the weights would go down through the middle of the spiral stairway. And the keepers would have to go to the top of the tower and crank up this machine. The weights would rise up, and it was the gradual falling of the weights that drove the rotation of the lens. So that was another big part of the job, where that had to be wound at night, I think about every 6 hours or something like that. So somebody was always on watch overnight, and part of the job overnight would be to wind that as needed. So I hope that answers the question. Eventually those all switch to electric rotation, but not every lighthouse lens rotates. A lot of them are fixed, unrotated, unflashing lenses, but a lot of them did rotate. And I also mentioned that a lot of them rotated on a mercury bed. Some had the chariot wheel system like Boston Light, but a lot of them floated on a mercury bed because mercury is a really good bearing. So, but it also emitted fumes and was probably not the healthiest thing to have in a lighthouse. There's only one lens in the country that still sits on mercury, and that's Split Rock Light in Minnesota on Lake Superior. But it's very carefully sealed up, and it's not an active lens anymore. But anyway, so
Fascinating.
yeah.
Kai asks, during World War II, did the Germans ever attack lighthouses?
Not in this country. Actually, I don't know of any case. I'm trying to remember. There have been lighthouses involved in battle in one way or another. I'm trying to remember. A lighthouse in British Columbia was hit by a lot of gunfire. I believe that was in which war was that in? I shouldn't have started saying that, because now I can't remember the story. But the answer to that question is no. In fact, there were a lot of German U-boats did attacks along the East Coast during the war. American ships were blown up off it was kind of hushed up. They didn't want people panicking over that during the war, but like off North Carolina, some ships were destroyed. But no attack on a lighthouse. So the answer is no. Yeah.
No. I just want to remind people to put your questions in the Q&A, because I lose track of them in the chat, because we have a lot in the Q&A right now. I have a couple questions about the children. When was the light run all winter? If so, how did the kids get to school? And if the children were living at the lighthouse, did they go to school there or in Boston?
Yeah, depends on which era you're talking about. As I think I mentioned, with the era when the Norwood kids were there with the 9 kids, and same with the Babcocks just before them, they bordered on the mainland, either in Winthrop to the north or Hull to the south. And during the school years, they go to school on the mainland and then live on the island in the summers and maybe school vacations. But earlier on, there were definitely a lot of kids who would either row back and forth or be rowed by their father to go to school in like Hull. But a lot of them were homeschooled too. That was pretty common. I know in Maine, for quite a while, the state of Maine would send traveling teachers to these places if there were at least 7 kids on an island. So these traveling young women teachers would go to various islands and teach the lighthouse kids. I don't think they did that in Massachusetts. So I think mostly before the early 1900s, when they started boarding on the mainland, I think they were pretty much homeschooled, the kids at Boston Light, for the most part. Yeah.
Okay. So do you think that lighthouses are still needed?
Well, I do, in the sense that they're important monuments and important positive symbols in our society. I think they do a lot of good, whether or not you believe they're still needed for navigation. But as far as are they needed for navigation, the answer is not so much, not anywhere near as they once were. They were once very central to navigation. Now everybody, whether it's big ships or small boats, they almost all have GPS and other modern electronics, but that stuff can fail. It doesn't hurt to have an actual backup, something physical that you see on the water there, lighthouses and buoys and various things. But they're not anywhere near as important as they once were. That's why we have over 800 standing lighthouses in this country, and approximately half of them are still active aids to navigation, but a lot have been turned off because they felt they weren't needed anymore. So the answer is kind of, I guess. Yeah, I mean, they still have importance for navigation, but I think their importance as historic monuments is more important at this point.
Mm-hmm. Adair says they read that the lenses were shipped in molasses. Is that true?
What an interesting question, because I don't know the details, but I know that I've heard that. Now I feel like I want to try to look it up and see what I can find out about that. But I don't think that was a standard practice, but I have heard that that was done somewhere. But again, I wish I could tell you more, but that's a really, really interesting question. I'm definitely going to see what I can find about that. Yeah, because I know I have heard it before. Yeah.
Mm-hmm. Larry asks, was Boston Light ever painted with a pattern for visibility in daylight? I recall when I visited Barnegat Light in New Jersey, it was painted red and white.
Yeah, that's called the day mark of a lighthouse, the paint job, the paint scheme, basically.
Mm-hmm.
In New England, almost all our lighthouses are simply white towers with black lanterns. There's a few like West Quoddy Headlight way up at the easternmost point in the U.S. and Maine that has red and white stripes, partly because tends to be a lot of snow there, so the red stands out against the snow. Most Canadian lighthouses have red on them, partly because of snow. But so our light in the south, like New Jersey, even farther south, the Carolinas, they have very distinctive day marks. Like Cape Hatteras has a barber pole stripe on it. St. Augustine in Florida has the same. In those places, a lot of times the lighthouses are on low beaches the beaches look pretty similar to each other. So that's why the lighthouses have distinctive day marks so they can easily be told one from another. But here in New England, the terrain varies so much, different harbors and, bluffs and so forth, that there doesn't seem to be the same issue telling one lighthouse from another as there is with a lot of those low-lying beaches in the south. I hope that makes sense. But I think that's why we don't have as many differentiating paint schemes, day marks on our lighthouses here in this part of the country. Yeah.
I just wanted to put in a plug that Jeremy's going to be talking about the Santas of lighthouses in, I think, November. And I just think that lighthouses should be, painted as candy canes during the holidays.
Well, West Quoddy Headlight pretty much is, if you look up what that looks like. I'm trying to remember the date for that. Yeah, I'm looking forward to that. So, as I mentioned, Edward Rowe Snow, who I talked a little bit about tonight, did the job of the Flying Santa for more than 40 years, but it was started by somebody else before him. November 3rd, I'll be doing that for you. Yeah, that'll be fun.
November 3rd. I think that'll be great. Are there boat rides to the light? I know we can't go onto the island. Is that true? I thought I visited that. No, I guess I didn't.
Well, if you did, it was probably at least 10 years ago.
Okay, then it was.
There were tours out there for quite a few years, but not now because of the pier being very badly damaged in storms. The Harbor Islands National Park does run lighthouse cruises where you go near it. There's a fairly short season. You can Google Boston Light Cruises and you'll find it easily, but they go on a boat near Boston Light and near Graves Light. Long Island, you saw the 3 lighthouses in Boston Harbor you see on the cruise, and they go close to Boston Light, but you don't land there. So that's as close as you can get these days.
Mm-hmm. Did the Boston Light play a role during the Civil War?
Nothing to speak of that no, it didn't. The only, of course, not much happened in the Civil War up, in New England anyway, really. But at Fort Warren on Boston Harbor, which I mentioned in the talk, there was a prison for Confederate prisoners, which is a pretty major thing. So that was the big connection Boston Harbor really had to the Civil War, was Fort Warren being a prison. Yeah.
From Boston Light, could people see Thatcher Light?
Thatcher Island to the south. I think I think the answer is yes, barely. Maybe on a really clear night, you may be able to see the flashing white light of the south light of the two lights at Thatcher Island. The other one's very dim. I believe that is the case. I don't think I was able to see it when I was there, but I believe I've heard that it's possible. Not sure how many miles that is, but so I believe I wouldn't stake my life on it, but I believe the answer is yes. On a really clear night, you can see the light. Yeah.
Do you know if the Boston Science Museum has an old Fresnel lens?
Uh, Funny you should ask because again, I grew up in Lynn and I loved the Museum of Science as a kid. I later worked there for 6 years, but they had a gigantic Fresnel lens from the Navesink Twin Lights in New Jersey, a first order lens, huge lens, and I think that may have had a lot to do with me getting interested in lighthouses. I saw it probably when I was first when I was like 6 years old. I had no idea what it was. I just knew it was amazing. I loved it. That lens is not there anymore at the museum. It was moved to back to Highlands, New Jersey, where the Navesink Twin Lights, where it came from. It's on display in its own building at that place, which is a great place to visit. The Navesink Twin Lights of Highland, New Jersey, at the entrance to New York Harbor. So that lens that was at the museum went back there. Yep.
So I have two more questions. What was the cost of the Boston Lights second order Fresnel?
I don't remember off the top of my head, but I'm going to say in the neighborhood of $10,000. It may have been a bit more than that, but I think that would have been the general neighborhood. I'd have to look it up. I don't remember for sure, but that's around what these larger lenses would cost in that era, which was a lot of money in 1859.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Who was paying for that? I guess I have more questions. Who was paying for that? Was it you said they're
Well,
not.
Congress, it was a congressional appropriation, so it's federal money. You know, the lighthouses were under the Treasury Department at that time. So the Lighthouse Service would have petitioned Congress for, funding. So yeah, it was appropriations.
How thick are the walls of the lighthouse?
I don't know the answer to that off the top of my head. They're thick. They're seriously thick. I'm gonna say you can actually see from windowsills. I guess you can get an idea of when from inside you look at the depth of a windowsill. It's a few feet. Again, I'd be guessing if I give a number, but definitely a few feet thick.
Okay, last question.
Mm-hmm.
Ralph asked, and I think this is such a good last question. Is the property privately owned? Many here in Michigan are and are used as homes.
It's funny you mentioned that because a really good friend of mine, Nick Korstad, owns the Big Bay Point Lighthouse on the Upper Peninsula in Michigan near Marquette and runs it as a B&B.
Mm-hmm.
And I've stayed there and it's great. I recommend it very highly. Well, Boston Light is still owned by the Coast Guard. And as I was saying, that's been talked about for probably 20 years now, the idea of it going to the National Park Service. And for whatever reason, that keeps getting delayed. But it's not going to be privately owned. If it goes from the Coast Guard to anybody, I think it'll be the National Park Service. Mm-hmm. If they decide they don't want it, and the Park Service is already underfunded, and now other things are happening that may make things even worse. But so maybe they'll decide they don't want it because they can't afford to take care of it. In that case, I'm not sure what'll happen. I think probably a nonprofit would get it. I don't think it would be auctioned to the public, but stranger things have happened. But as of now, it's owned by the Coast Guard. Long way of answering that. Yeah.
So follow-up question to that is, are there any lighthouses that we can stay in, like on the East Coast?
On the East Coast, yes.
Well, in the New England area.
Well, yeah. There's a few, yeah. Little River Light way up on the northern Maine coast in Cutler, Maine, great place to stay. Race Point Light at the tip of Cape Cod in Provincetown. Mm-hmm. Way out in the dunes, you get 4-wheel drive transportation out there. You got to bring your own food and stuff, but it's a great place to stay. Rose Island Light, Newport, Rhode Island. You can stay upstairs. There's an apartment you can rent for like a week, or you can stay in a downstairs room for just a night or two if you want. It's a wonderful place. There's a bunch of other ones. There's another one in Rhode Island that just became a B&B called Bristol Ferry Light in Bristol. I'm interviewing the owner very soon for my podcast. I could go on. Those are the ones that come to mind, but there's a few others. Go to uslhs.org, the U.S. Lighthouse Society's website. There is a list of lighthouses with accommodations on there.
All right, you heard it, people. do your Googling. Jeremy, this has been fantastic, just as I expected, but I always learn a lot, but people here have had some amazing questions. I really appreciate that too.
They
So
were really good questions. Yeah.
yeah, some that stumped you, which was unusual.
Yeah. I did see another question. It might have been in the chat. I was looking at the chat. But I just want to mention somebody asked, does Boston Light have a 143 flash? That's Minot's Light down south of Boston. That has a very famous one flash, pause, four flashes, three flashes. And people decided it stood for I love you, so they call it the I love you light. So it's not Boston Light. Boston Light just has a white flash every, I forget how many seconds, but Minus has the very famous 143. Just to answer that person's question.
Awesome. I wasn't sure if that was the same question as the painting, like the different colors of the paint. So I didn't ask that one. I'm glad you caught it. But yeah, we will see you in November for Santa Talk, and I really am looking forward to that. That sounds like so much fun.
It will be.
Thanks, Jeremy. Thanks everybody for being here, and we'll hopefully see you all soon. Have a great night.
Thank you, Mina. Thanks, everyone.
Bye, Jeremy.
Bye.